Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Mark Tokola of KEI. Two of the most interesting current trends in international relations are the merging of economic and security policy, and second, the merging of Atlantic and Pacific policy concerns. So both these trends can be seen in Korea and Japan's developing partnerships with NATO. They attended the Madrid summit last year, and they both attended the Vilnius NATO Summit in July of this year. That's something new. It demonstrates the coming together of Atlantic and Pacific policy interests. On the merger of economic and security policy, the NATO agendas for its partnerships now includes non-traditional security issues, such as disruptive technologies, cyber defense, and climate change. I'm delighted that we'll be able to discuss Korea and Japan's developing partnerships with NATO with James Mackey. He's Director of Security Policy and Partnerships at NATO headquarters. He's joining us from Brussels. And here in the studio, Kamei Isozaki, the Japan Chair Fellow at the Hudson Institute, formerly of the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Ministry of Defense. So Kamei, do you want to make some opening comments before we turn to James?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for coming here. Thank you for watching. I'm Kamei Isozaki, Hudson Institute, Japan Chair Fellow. I think it is significant to have four Asian partners joining the NATO Summit: Australia, New Zealand, Korea, and Japan. Particularly during the summit on the side on July 11th, last month, in Lithuania, Korea and Japan each signed a ITPP, individually tailored partnership programs with NATO's. Those are, I think, show development, also the expectations and hope for the more development with the relationship with NATO's and those countries. And there are several histories of relationship in the past, but I can mention that Japan at least had a decade of history with the relationship with NATO's. Of course, occasionally we visit each other before, but 2013 on April, Prime Minister Abe and Secretary General of the NATO met and agreed on the cooperations on disaster relief and other issues, particularly, and they also established a joint study group how to develop the relationship with Japan and NATO's. And next year, 2014, they did some crisis management exercise called CMX. And also they do some work on civil protections, including defense against chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear weapons, CBRN, securities. And then they also agreed IPCP in 2014, Individual Partnership Cooperation Program. So they revised this, or maybe upgraded this IPCP twice in 2018 and 2020. And so this time the ITPP is, I think, an outcome of those developments in the past decade. And I think the most important thing and also characteristic of this agreement is very practical, what they have done in the past and what they can do in the next decades. And what motivated this initiative and the movement is, I think, the Russian invasion of Ukraine last year. That is, I think, a fundamental blow to challenges to the world. Also, the recognition of the security of Euro-Atlantic zone is inseparable from that of Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific. So remember but I think from the MOD side, I remember in 2014 or 15, I visited NATO's Center of Excellence for Cyber Defense in Estonia. And we discussed how we can develop, how we cooperate in a cyber defense. And we discussed about sending Japanese officers or staff to Center of Excellence. Also, we proposed to participate in the exercise in a cyber defense. And then now, I think a few years later, it's already occurred. And I think we've kind of sort of regular participant to the NATO's cyber exercise. And in the diplomatic front, Japanese embassy in Belgium established some NATO sections and also some officers who are responsible for the NATOs. I remember, in addition to the defense attaché there, Minister of Defense and secretary to our embassy in Belgium. And he is dealing with the NATO issues as well. And in 2018, Japanese government established a permanent mission to the NATOs in the embassy. So that's, I think, more important diplomatic development. Also, Japanese Ministry of Defense, Self-Defense Force, sent an officer to the SHAPE, NATO's military headquarters in Belgium. I think it's the first one is from Grand Self-Defense Force, the female officers. And she's doing some civil work and also women's issues in the NATOs. So those are, I think, the cyber and those human rights, women's issues are important areas of cooperation. But in the most recent agreement, there's 16, I think, goals, 16 areas of cooperation is specified. That is a very specific point, like disruptive technologies and the quantum space. So those areas are new and also global. So it's very natural to cooperate with NATO and Japan, also even Korea as well. So if I can say something more realistic, more material issues like industrial corporations, so Japan has decided to co-develop a next generation fighters with the United Kingdom and Italy. So those program is called Global Combat Air Program, GCAP. So this name of the global could mean that this new fighter is not just for these three countries, but for other partners like NATO. NATO is, I think, most close and possible partners to share those new fighters' equipment. And also, in operational side, the Japanese Self-Defense Force has experience in combating counter-piracy operations in the Gulf of Aden. Also, we have some experience of watching North Korean ships inspections for on the seas. So those maritime operations, and in addition to exercise on HADR, so we and NATO and Japan cooperate to disaster relief operations, in real operations in Turkey after the earthquake early this year. So those are the areas and the very pragmatic, practical areas of cooperation. So the final, I should also mention some challenges or limits of the cooperation. So Japan is not the member of the NATO countries. So Article 5 of the NATO wouldn't apply to Japan. So Japan, it's unthinkable that Japan will exercise collective self-defense for the NATO countries, or vice versa. So NATO is fighting for the defense of Japan. So we shouldn't expect that. But because of those limits, and also we can cooperate pragmatically of capacity building and sharing information. And through NATO's cooperation, I expect that relationship with Korea and Japan, it's developing very rapidly in the past years. I think so cooperation in the NATO framework, I expect Korea-Japan will develop further because it's very fundamentally important for each other of security.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, thank you. I'll say the Japanese and Korean ITPPs with NATO are very similar, but not exactly the same. There's some differences, but they're very similar. Mr. Maki, thank you for joining us. We want to focus on NATO's partnerships with Korea and Japan today. But first, for context, I wonder if you could share with us what you thought the most important developments were from the Vilnius Summit.
Sure, happy to do so. And thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. And I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but even in August, duty calls in Brussels. But thanks very much for organizing this and for inviting me. Just to talk about sort of overall the context in which the summit took place, obviously the key factor that we were looking at was Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine and continuing invasion of Ukraine. And that had sort of the significant impact on everything we delivered for the summit. So I would say there were sort of the the first key area where we were thinking about what we had to deliver for the summit was pretty much the most complete overhaul of NATO's defensive plans since the Cold War. And this is just based on the threat picture that we see. It is a much more dangerous Europe with an aggressive Russia, which is changing boundaries in Europe. And so we overhauled not only NATO's defensive plans, but we also looked at the readiness of our forces and our ability to implement those plans. And I would say that was number one in terms of what we delivered. We also had a meeting with Ukraine, and we spent a lot of time at the summit talking about what we can do to support Ukraine in upholding its right to self-defense under the UN Charter, both in the immediate term, but also in the mid to long term, as we think about Ukraine rebuilding, hopefully at the end of the conflict on Ukraine's terms, and also how we ensure that Ukraine is able to uphold its stability and security in the future. So that was another very significant part of what we talked about. And I think the participation of the 4 Indo-Pacific partners for NATO can be seen very much in the context of those first 2 things that I mentioned. I think that all 4 of those partners have been very clear about their strong disagreement and condemnation of Russia's actions. And their belief that actually Russia's actions are having a global impact on security, whether we talk about energy and fuel prices, whether we talk about the food prices and food scarcity, which is caused by Russia's actions, but also more generally, the challenge to the UN Charter and the international law system. So I think that was important. The Indo-Pacific partners felt that they also wanted to be there in order to show solidarity with Ukraine and to talk about the fact that this invasion is a global challenge to security. And so that I would say that those are sort of 3 of the biggest things that set the context for the summit in Vilnius.
Okay, thank you. I should say that we'll save some time for questions from the audience, both in person and online. But maybe turning to Korea and Japan, maybe we should talk about the why before we talk about the how. So why is NATO becoming more interested in the Indo-Pacific region?
Sure. I think I would start by saying that NATO is a North Atlantic organization, and it will remain a North Atlantic organization. So the founding treaty confines the geographic area, and I don't think anyone is thinking about or even talking about expanding that. We are a consensus-based organization with currently 31 member states, and I think the consensus is that NATO remains a Euro-Atlantic security organization focused on Article 5. But at the same time, I think we see increasingly that the security challenges we face are global in nature. And so NATO, while we remain a regional organization, we want to have global connections. And I think, I won't quote too much from the ITPPs, but just to sort of say that one of the things that we saw in the ITPPs for both Korea and Japan is strategic competition, pervasive instability, and recurrent shocks define our broader security environment. The threats we face are global and interconnected. Authoritarian actors challenge our interests, values, and democratic way of life. And so whether you're looking at those challenges from the Euro-Atlantic region or the Indo-Pacific region, they are largely the same challenges. And so we feel it's very important to talk to like-minded countries who share our values and who are interested in exchanging information with us, not only at the political level and at the intelligence level, but also at a very practical level. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into some of the specifics of the 2 ITPP areas of work.
Okay, I'm looking into the ITPPs a little bit. First, I'll echo what Komei said about the Japan relationship. It's true about Korea's relationship with NATO too. It's not new. NATO has been talking with South Korea in dialogue and cooperation since 2005. And in 2012, they signed the Individual Partnership and Cooperation Program, the IPCP. So how is the new Individually Tailored Partnership Program, ITPP, different?
Sure. I think that as Komei also said in his introductory remarks on Japan, I think that the 2 ITPP documents, and I apologize in advance for all of the NATO acronyms we may throw out, I'll try and keep it to a minimum, but hopefully we can limit it to ITPP. The 2 new documents, we really wanted to get both of them done in time for the Vilnius Summit. Because we think that they capture quite a significant change in both the cooperation with Japan and the cooperation with Korea. And the ITPP documents are meant to encompass the entirety of the relationship. And in the past, I think a lot of the cooperation that we had under the IPCP was substantial, was significant, but it was maybe not quite as coordinated as it could have been. And so what I would say the biggest change with the ITPP is we now have at the top level with both countries an agreed set of strategic objectives and then goals that we're going to try to pursue in order to meet those strategic objectives. And then a whole series of actual activities and exercises and program activities that we're going to undertake in order to try and achieve those goals in support of the strategic objectives. So for both countries, that document now provides sort of a much more strategic framework in order to try and sort of organize and bring together our cooperation. But we're also at the same time catching up a little bit or capturing a lot of the practical work that's been advanced. And Kome mentioned, things like working with the Cyber Defense Center of Excellence. We're talking a lot more about new areas of work like counter-hybrid and national resilience. We're also talking about emerging and disruptive technologies. And NATO's policy is also advancing in these areas as we take on these new challenges. We try and address these new challenges for the security of our allies. And we wanted to make sure that our cooperation with these two partners reflects that change in NATO policy and sort of the expanded areas for cooperation. So with the ITPP, we're both trying to deepen the cooperation by having that cooperation work towards a very clear, agreed set of strategic objectives, but we're also trying to broaden the cooperation to include many of the new areas of work for NATO.
President Yoon Suk-yeol said that the first Korean attendance at the Madrid summit last year was to lay the foundations for future relationship. He said this attendance this year at Vilnius was to start implementing it, to institutionalize it. So I wonder if you could talk about kind of the nuts and bolts of how NATO and Korea actually talk. Who talks to who, when? Are there working groups?
Sure. So I think, we always start from the political, we're strategic headquarters, but I think we begin with political dialogue. And that political dialogue takes place, oftentimes it takes place in NATO allies, so the 31 NATO allies, plus our 4 partners in the Indo-Pacific. And it's oftentimes we do that because actually the challenges we're talking about are common to all 4 of those countries. So if we're talking about things, for instance, Kome mentioned humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, or we're talking about challenges to freedom of navigation, or we're talking about proliferation, whether it be nuclear or missile proliferation. So we'll oftentimes have a discussion at the political level of that. But we also do have political discussions with each of the partners individually. On specific topics or issues where they want to just talk to themselves directly to NATO. That's sort of at the political level, but then within that overall political chapeau, NATO runs about 1,200 activities per year. And it's everything from English language training to cyber defense exercises to very detailed discussions about military standards and how do we achieve interoperability, including in new areas, for instance, like space or cyber or autonomous weapon systems. And so there is the political discussions which allow us to sort of look at the challenge we face and what are we politically seeing and doing. But then we try to very much get into very specific working groups. And as I mentioned, it's about 1,200 activities. We have several hundred working groups that look at very, very specific areas of military interoperability. And so with our partners, based on the programs we've agreed, we will then go in and talk sort of in great detail about specific areas, either threats that we're seeing or specific standards that we're trying to achieve. And at the end of the day, NATO is very much a standard-setting organization. We're sort of a platform for multinational military cooperation on setting standards. And so particularly for partners with whom we're close, like Korea and Japan, we're trying to bring them into more and more of those discussions, including more sensitive discussions about both the threats we're seeing, but also the specific capabilities we're developing, and how do we make capabilities that are to a set standard internationally.
James, I applaud your ability to speak for NATO and not use acronyms. That's quite remarkable. Kome, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, so I have questions, and you've already answered some, but James, thank you for explaining the NATO's lot of works. Perhaps most of them you have to manage. My question is, how would you manage those expanded allies and partners of NATO? So how would you make decision-making process? Because even the NATO members, 32 countries, so that is I think, big from the original countries. Considering from original countries, so many countries and heads of states, it's hard to reach a consensus sometimes. So how would you manage? Is there any mechanism to manage those decision-making with members? Plus, like 4 countries or other traditional partners, like Partnership for Peace, how would you manage those countries?
Sure, and it is a lot. It's 31 member states plus Sweden. I didn't mention that in sort of our highlights for the summit, but we did also make some progress on Sweden's membership. So we're optimistic that we'll see some concrete progress on that this autumn towards finalizing Sweden's membership in NATO. And I mean, the question of NATO consensus is a very old one. And what I usually say is that consensus is both the best thing and the worst thing. It's a great strength, but also a challenge, because you have to get 31 sovereign countries to agree on a policy. But the fact is that when they do take decisions, and they take decisions each and every day here, then those are quite strong decisions because we have consensus. And I won't bore you with all the details of the NATO communique, but for those who are gluttons for punishment, you can go through and read it in all its glory. However, something like 85 paragraphs or longer. And that is 85 paragraphs where we have achieved full consensus among all 31 allies about the future of our alliance. You can also look last year at the new strategic concept that we agreed for the Madrid summit, and that lays out the 10-year vision of what NATO will do, what missions and operations will undertake, and what is the purpose and the direction of the alliance over 10 years. And again, that is a document which is agreed by all 31 countries. So it is extremely difficult to get to consensus because each country is sovereign. Everyone has the same vote at the table. And then we talk about working with our partners as well. And I think the thing I would stress here is that partners are not part of the consensus of NATO, right? There's a difference between being a member and not being a member. The partners don't get a vote unless, of course, it is the individual cooperation program. So for instance, the ITPP between Japan and NATO was agreed with 31 allies plus Japan. And that is sort of the key when we work with partners, is everything is done on a voluntary basis. NATO doesn't make any demands. It is a decision between NATO and the partner country concerned, what we do and what we do not do. We set the boundaries and the limits. But I think that the way that we're able to sort of help organize that is we look at the specific interests that the partner has for working with NATO. Then we look at the interests of NATO. Obviously, for NATO, it's extremely beneficial to have cooperation with countries like Korea and Japan, both of which are advanced democracies, both of which have significant military and technological capability, and both of which are doing work in a lot of areas that NATO is looking at. Just to give you one example, we talk about military activity in space and the potential consequences of military conflict in space. And obviously, both Korea and Japan are extremely concerned about this. So it makes sense for NATO to speak to countries that have both an interest and a capability and who can contribute something to the NATO discussion. In terms of how do we organize it, we have 35 partner countries plus 31 members, hopefully soon to be 32 members. Plus, I would say we have about 15 or 16 other countries who are not partners who want to normally engage. Like for instance, we do quite a bit with Singapore. It's not a formal partner of NATO, but we probably do about 15 or 20 activities per year with Singapore, mostly in the scientific and technical fields. And so the way that we organize it is, as I said, we sort of look at the partners' interests or the countries, the non-partners' interests. We look at NATO's interest, and then we try and sort of find out where the overlap of that is. In general, what I would say is that our work with partners falls into four main categories. There's political and security dialogue that's talking about our perceptions and what we think we should do about it. There is a whole strand of work that we have on interoperability, which is making sure that our armed forces can work together when we want to work together. And then the third key pillar of cooperation with partners focuses on capacity building. And we do a lot of work with countries like Republic of Moldova, Georgia, Ukraine, Jordan, to make sure that they have the capacity to handle the security challenges they face. And then sort of a fourth pillar or fourth key area is emerging challenges and emerging and disruptive technologies. And so we're talking to countries about climate change, gender issues, women, peace, and security, also emerging and disruptive technologies. So in general, it is a lot. It's a very broad scope. It's a lot of countries, but we have a whole process in place to try and identify the overlap between partner countries' interests and NATO's interests. And as I said, generally, those activities fall into one of those four pillars: political, interoperability, capacity building, and then emerging and disruptive technologies.
Thank you. I saw that Japan's agreement with NATO is four areas of categories based on your categorization. I think that's a good thing too. NATO has a kind of standardized relationship and areas of cooperation. My another question is a very Japan-specific story, and so there was a report about establishment of a Tokyo office of NATO's, and also a report of President Macron of France is opposing that idea. So what will be the, I hope it's not too sensitive, what is the possible roles of regional offices? Not in Tokyo, but also anywhere.
Sure, yeah, and you will not be surprised, this is not the first time I have gotten this question since
of course.
Summit.
Yeah.
So, I mean, as I said before, we are a consensus-based organization. We must have consensus of all member states in order to do something. And in this particular case, there was a proposal that we had been discussing about whether to establish a small civilian liaison office in Tokyo, and we did not achieve consensus on that in time for the Vilnius Summit. So the proposal is to have a small civilian presence, probably only one or two people, with the main goal of trying to enhance cooperation between NATO and Japan, exchange information more effectively, make sure that Japan is taking advantage of all the opportunities available. And that was sort of the proposal, but it did not meet consensus in time for the Vilnius Summit. But the Secretary General, I think, has been clear this is an issue we will continue to discuss to see what we can do to maybe try and achieve consensus on it in the future. I will say that we have liaison offices, and you asked sort of about generally the role in general of liaison offices. We have quite a few liaison offices. Most of them are relatively small. As I said, only 1 to 2 people, diplomats generally. And for instance, we have, well, actually, it's quite a significant office in Kiev, in Ukraine, but offices in Georgia, in Republic of Moldova. But we also have offices in, for instance, in New York to be liaison to the United Nations headquarters. We also have an office in Vienna to work with the OSCE. And allies took the decision in Vilnius that we will establish an office in Geneva, which will be focused on working with the United Nations organizations based in Geneva. And in general, those offices, their job is to try and make sure that NATO has the correct information about what's happening with wherever the area of responsibility, but then also to really try and identify and facilitate and highlight opportunities for better cooperation. So it's something we'll keep talking about in the future, and hopefully we'll get to consensus at some point.
Thank you. If I may have a third one, is in the Vilnius communique, the NATO members agreed on welcomed the establishment of the Space Center of Excellence in France. So is it possible that Korea and Japan could have some relationship, like join some exercise or sending people there to train themselves?
Sure, certainly. I think that's something that we'll be discussing in the future. So the centers of excellence are contributed at a multinational level. So a group of allies come together, they create a center, and then which focuses on a specific program of work. And then we looked on how to plug the partners into that work. Now, the specific way in which cooperation happens with partners is based on the specific mandate of each center and what those allies who are the contributors or the founders of that center, they always sort of have a policy or a look at how they wish to have partners participate in the work of that center. And I think that, we mentioned already the Cyber Defense Center of Excellence in Estonia, where both Korea and Japan have signed cooperation agreements and regularly send liaison officers in order to be able to participate fully in the work of that center. And we certainly expect, given that space is going to be an area of increased cooperation for both Korea and Japan, I do expect that we will see work from both countries with the Center of Excellence that was established in France.
Okay, I'll ask one more question myself, and then we'll turn to the audience online and in person. Kome mentioned that Ukraine has been one of the reasons that Japan, Korea, and NATO have been talking more these days. But I suspect that unease between Europe and China has had something to do with it too. You say the documents are consensus. It's remarkable the Madrid document, the communique, achieved by consensus of all the member states, was so tough in its language on China. It was quite remarkable. So maybe you could talk about NATO's relationship and how it views relations with China these days.
Sure, and I think both the communique, but I would also definitely recommend for those who are interested looking at the strategic concept as well. Because as I said, that document's looking out sort of over 10 years. And what we clearly see is that China presents a challenge to the security of the alliance. And that you'll oftentimes hear the NATO Secretary General say, look, NATO is not going to the Indo-Pacific. We're not doing exercises. NATO does not intend to become an Indo-Pacific player in the security sphere. But we do very much see that China is coming to us. And whether that is challenges to resilience, whether it is investment in strategic areas, whether it's political interference, whether it is disinformation about NATO and about Western governments in general, but also, quite honestly, we see increasingly coherent positions and support between Russia and China in terms of challenging the UN system and challenging global norms, standards, and international law. So China is clearly having an impact on the security of the alliance, and it's something we're looking increasingly at. Now, I think we're very clear that China is not a threat to NATO because it is not, as Russia is, threatening to launch military action against the alliance. So we have two agreed strategic threats that the alliance faces, which are Russia and terrorism, and both of which are on a daily basis something we're working towards. But we certainly see a number of not only the specific capabilities China is developing, but it's also its stated intentions for the future as challenges to our security. And so this is certainly something that we talk about with our Indo-Pacific partners, but I would also stress that it is not the sum total of what we talk about. We have a lot of other challenges that we need to talk to our Indo-Pacific partners about. First and foremost, DPRK and proliferation of missiles and nuclear proliferation, but also a number of other areas we've mentioned about sort of the challenges that all of us are going to face, for instance, with autonomous weapon systems, big data, artificial intelligence, how those impact warfare, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, and then also other challenges to global norms and standards, and also things like climate change and security. So we certainly obviously are exchanging information with our Indo-Pacific partners about the challenge that they see from China as well, but also our cooperation goes much broader than just that.
Okay, I'm glad you mentioned North Korea because I forgot to. It's like any event we're talking about Japan, Korea, NATO, and you have to mention North Korea. So is NATO following developments in North Korea closely?
Yes, we do. And we actually have for quite some time. And you will see going back at least 10 or 12 years, regular statements from the North Atlantic Council, condemning the actions of the DPRK regime, where they challenge in particular nuclear proliferation. because we do believe that those are challenges, those are in fact violation of UN Security Council resolutions. They're a violation of DPRK's international commitments, and they threaten stability and security on a global level. And so we have consistently seen the NATO allies be very clear about wanting to call out malign behavior by the DPRK regime, and I think we will continue to see that. But as I mentioned, as we see increasing capabilities on things like missile tech and nuclear capabilities, that is clearly something that we also want to talk to our partners, Republic of Korea and Japan, about.
Okay, Kami, any follow-ups before we turn to audience?
Yeah, I think in terms of North Korea is a good point. Sorry, I didn't mention either. And also, there's North Korea is also some not a formal, but it's the Russia-North Korea relationship is developing during the Ukraine crisis as well. So North Korea maybe sending a personnel to Russia to help something. So also. In the past, at least, Russia helped, or Soviet Union helped North Korea to develop weapons of mass destruction, or sometimes potentially war against the South. So those are, I think, a threat. And also in terms of the global challenges, and I found Japanese strategy documents, which was published last December, National Security Strategy, National Defense Strategies. They say about the cooperation with NATO and European countries, we should address not only global challenges, but specific challenges each country has. So those, I think, specific challenges, we can share some of the capacities, we can cooperate. We are not defending for the other's sake as a collective self-defense, but we can cooperate and to address specific challenges the NATO has or Japan or Korea has.
Okay, we'll turn to audience. Hands already. We have a roving microphone we'll bring to you. So first here.
Hi, Eunjung Cho with the Voice of America. First to Mr. Mackey. You have expertise in NATO intelligence sharing, and at Vilnius, South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol said that South Korea will participate in NATO BICES, Battlefield Info Collection and Exploitation System. How does South Korea participating in the BICES help South Korea better deal with its more immediate and existential threat of North Korea? And also under ITPP, the South Korea and NATO decided to discuss South Korean forces joining NATO-led military exercises. Are there any progress on that front? When do you envision that happening? And for Mr. Isozaki, you mentioned about the potential field where Japan and NATO could cooperate in the maritime field of watching North Korean ship-to-ship illegal transfers. Could you elaborate more on how Japan and NATO could cooperate on that front? Thank you.
Hey, Jim is first.
Sure. Obviously, I can't go into too many details in a public forum about the intelligence exchange that we have with our partner countries, but just to say that I think one of the key aspects of having a deeper partnership is increasing the level of trust that we have between NATO and the partners concerned. And we do try where we can to increase the exchange of intelligence information. And that is focused on, the threats and challenges we're facing, the increased capabilities we're seeing. And that is part, I would say, a very important part or adjunct of our political dialogue. Because if we try and ensure that our political discussions are informed by solid and shared intelligence. And that makes the political discussions more robust and makes the decisions stronger and better informed. And so we are looking for where we can increase that intelligence exchange as part of ensuring that we have a shared operational picture of the many threats and challenges that we face. And again, just to sort of stress that has to be done very much, no one is forced to exchange any intelligence or provide anything. It is always on a voluntary basis, as it is even among the NATO allies. So the NATO allies share information with each other all the time on the basis of trust and some specific systems. but that is never sort of forced. It's always a contribution to try and have a shared picture of a specific challenge that we face. And, to give one example of where this worked extremely well, in the run-up to Russia's renewed aggression against Ukraine in the fall of 2021 into the beginning of 2022, NATO allies were sharing intelligence with each other about what we were seeing. And we were also sharing that intelligence with our close partners to demonstrate to them that we saw a clear pattern of aggression and a clear intent to launch a military aggression against Ukraine. And so that allowed us to be better prepared for when that actually did start, to be able to have a very robust international response, including imposing sanctions quite quickly, quite drastic sanctions quite quickly, and be able to respond quickly to that. In terms of the military exercises, again, I would just sort of stress, NATO is not seeking to become an Indo-Pacific country or an Indo-Pacific power. And so I don't think that we will see NATO exercises in the Indo-Pacific region. Because it's also, there's an issue of resources and distance involved. And likewise, I don't expect that we will see large numbers of forces, either from Japan or Republic of Korea, which will be coming to Europe in order to train and exercise. But I do think that for a number of sort of higher end things like tabletop exercises, where we're looking at the strategic level, we also mentioned the Cyber Defense Center of Excellence. NATO has a very robust program of cyber defense exercises. And so it's very likely that we will see both Korean and Japanese participation in NATO exercises on cyber defense, and maybe likewise NATO will come at least to observe or potentially participate in cyber defense exercises held by either of those two partner countries. And so what we need to do is figure out, where does it make sense, both from a substance standpoint, but also from a resources standpoint, in order to plug in. And as we talk about some of these new emerging and disruptive technologies, what we're not necessarily going to see big military exercises in the field, but it may be much more computer assisted or tabletop exercises. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm actually glad there's communications that go on that we don't know about. That shows a certain seriousness and depth of the relationship. So keep doing that, please.
Yeah.
And on also another point on the on NATO presence in the Indo-Pacific. A lot of European countries are members of the United Nations Command in South Korea, on the Korean Peninsula. There's actually quite a bit of European presence in exercising as part of the UNC in Korea, apart from NATO. Mr. Kame?
Yes, I agree. So Japan's relationship with NATO is becoming more and more regular and more systematic. But relationship with individual member countries like United Kingdom, France, have a long history, and then also individual agreement and joint training a lot. So as answering to the questions from the audience, that Japan is already cooperating with NATO in the counter-piracy operation, as I mentioned. Also, it's not specific, but so inspection of the North Korean vessels in there is probably around the areas of Japan is we are already cooperating with NATO members. I don't know which, as a NATO, but NATO members. So it's a potentially, so we could have some more like intelligence sharing with those countries and also with NATO itself. That's a potential. So I shouldn't go into detail about the intelligence sharing, but I think I can imagine that it's a natural outcome of the cooperation.
Okay, our next question was here.
Thank you. My name is Hiro Watanabe, Japanese newspaper Sankei Shimbun. I think both NATO and its partners in the Pacific are very much concerned with closer cooperation between China and Russia. We see a very big naval patrol close to Aleutian Islands recently, and both Russia and China are very much cooperating in Arctic Sea. to develop economic and military. So do you think the collaboration between NATO and its partners in the Pacific, like South Korea, Japan, and maybe Australia, can deter further collaboration between Russia and China, in particular in East Asia? Does make sense?
Yes, I see. Maybe first, James, maybe all comments from the stage.
Sure. So I think I want to be clear that, NATO's cooperation with the partners in the Indo-Pacific is based off of our shared interests. It's not directed against anyone, whether it's Russia or China. It's on the basis of our own right to be able to prepare and to develop new capabilities and to cooperate internationally with whom we want to cooperate. And I think certainly that Russia and China also have a right to cooperate with each other. But I think where we would disagree there, is that several aspects. Number one is that oftentimes this cooperation, in terms of the naval patrols, is not done in a transparent way. We don't really have, actually we have fewer and fewer mechanisms in terms of things like confidence building measures and also in terms of international norms and standards, in terms of safe intercept or safe passage in those areas. And quite often, as I mentioned earlier, we see Russia and China challenging global norms and international law, and oftentimes challenging long-held international standards we have through the United Nations system. And so I think that is something we watch closely, and certainly something that we will have to keep an eye on in the future. But in terms of whether NATO will, with its Indo-Pacific partners, seek to deter that activity, it's not something that's on the table, because, as I said, NATO doesn't expect to be operating in the Indo-Pacific. To a little bit to what Kome said last time, is that there are, of course, individual NATO allies who are Indo-Pacific powers, Indo-Pacific nations, and also have extremely robust cooperation with both Japan and Republic of Korea. And so they will certainly be working with their alliance partners in the Indo-Pacific to be able to handle the security challenges that they face. But what I would also highlight too is that NATO believes quite strongly that we do need to have internationally accepted norms and standards for the safety of military exercises, for transparency and accountability and inspections regarding development of new weapon systems. And we do think that we do need to have strong support for legally binding international arms control treaties. And that is how all of us will be safer in the longer term. And we hope that both Russia and China will participate in those activities, because that will make all of us safer at the global level. Thanks.
Yeah, I'd say that deterrence, too, is kind of a broad concept. I think the fact that the Atlantic Alliance and its partners were able to react so swiftly and with strength to the Russian invasion of Crimea puts all countries on notice that the alliance is prepared to defend its interests and knows how to do it. Okay, over here, please. I'm sorry, got online saying? Good. We got an online question first.
Sneak in my question here.
Okay.
I noticed that one word has not come up in this whole discussion, which is really quite amazing. The word Taiwan. Not one of you has mentioned Taiwan as something that NATO should consider, nor has there been any mention of Japan's interest in Taiwan. Mr. Aso was just there warning of much increased tensions and dangers surrounding Taiwan. So could you let us know what NATO thinks of Taiwan, what NATO would do about Taiwan, and what Japan might do about Taiwan in conjunction with NATO? Thank you.
I think I heard the word NATO in there, so James, you want to
James, you
take
go
that one
first,
first?
and I can go next.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay, first, sure, I'm happy to do it. I just want to stress, NATO is a Euro-Atlantic organization. And so NATO does not have any specific treaty obligations, and in fact believes that what's most important is for regional security organizations and regional security architectures to take care of the security in those specific regions. I think we would certainly believe, though, that ensuring the status quo across the Taiwan Straits on a defense and security issue is extremely important to global security. Because anyone who thinks that a conflict across the Taiwan Straits or tension across the Taiwan Straits would not have a global impact is fooling themselves. Okay, just even if you look at the amount of international trade, including European trade, that goes through the Taiwan Straits. If you think about in terms of the economic connections that Taiwan has to the rest of the world, if you think about the tension that would be involved internationally, if there was to be an attempt to change the status quo by force, I think we're very, very aware of the fact that this would have a massively negative impact for global security. So it's certainly something that we discuss with our partner nations as part of our overall discussion about the security challenges that they face, that they see in their particular region. And NATO is first and foremost a supporter of the UN international system, which focuses on peaceful resolution of disputes and protection of global norms and standards. So I think I would say that, and then I would defer in terms of what Japan thinks about the Taiwan scenario or what any individual NATO allies think. I'm going to defer on that one because I'm not an authority on those issues. So maybe defer to Koman whether he wants to say something about Japan's specific interests.
It's tough questions, actually. Thank you very much for the question to give me an opportunity to think about NATO and Taiwan. As I mentioned in my initial remarks, that it's unthinkable that Japan is fighting for the defense of NATO countries or NATO countries fighting for Japan. Taiwan is not a NATO member, but peace and stability of Taiwan Strait is an interest of NATO's or Japan or Korea's or any countries globally. So I think we could cooperate in a public diplomacy front that we will oppose any use of force to change the status quo. That's the area we can cooperate in a NATO context.
Yeah, if you look at any end of international documents, communiques, joint statements, those words opposing change of status quo by force, read Taiwan. But South Korea said the same. Sang, you had an online question?
Yes. So the online question is, how does NATO view growing ties with South Korea and Japan defense industries, UK R&D with Japan, and Polish deals with ROK comes to mind? Would Seoul and Tokyo play a role in helping diversify NATO's defense supply chains?
Sure, I'll take this one. I think that's probably, although maybe Kome wants to come in, but just to say that it very much is part of both of the ITPP documents, is talking about both the changing standards that we see or the development of new standards in new areas, but also defense industrial cooperation. And we see this really as a win for both NATO and for both Korea and Japan. And it's part of our effort both to diversify supply chains, but also to ensure resilience. We are at the stage right now where NATO allies are contributing an enormous amount of weapons and ammunition to Ukraine in order to help Ukraine ensure its right to self-defense or carry out its right to self-defense. But that also means that we need to then both backfill what has been given to Ukraine, but also upgrade what has been given based on the new security challenge and the threats we face. And I mentioned the new defense plans and sort of the new capabilities and readiness that we agreed at the Vilnius Summit. So certainly discussion about standards and defense cooperation is something that's going to be central to the work that we do on the ITPP with both Korea and Japan.
Agreed. And then I think, as James mentioned, the NATO is playing a great role in standardize the weapons or operations of the militaries or other areas. And so as I mentioned that Japan is agreed for the next generation joint fighters with Italy and the United Kingdom. So if we standardize and those fighters or even other weapons, so South Korea and Japan has a more chance to cooperate and with NATO and in the productions or export, import, share those weapon systems or other weapon-related areas, even dual-use systems like a cyber and the space system.
Okay, Stanley?
Stanley Kober. Listening to this, I recall a statement attributed to General Bradley. Amateurs talk strategy. Professionals talk logistics. Since this is an economic institute, let's talk economics in place of logistics. Japan was supposed to be number 1 30 years ago. It is now number 3 and dropping. It has a shrinking population and debt that is out of control. How can it afford a defense buildup? And that applies even to us. Interest on the national debt now exceeds the defense budget here. I see no way that can be reversed. How do we afford all this? I need to see budgets and how we justify the budgets.
Yeah, tough questions. And then, so I thought in the past that it would be impossible for Japan to increase the defense budget, but they decided last December that they will double the defense budget. So if the threats and challenges are recognized by the whole nations or people, and we can go increase the budget fundamentally. But of course, Japan's population is declining, and then a lot of economic issues are hard for any countries, in any industrial countries. So that's why I think we should cooperate rather than individually developing everything. So we can cooperate to more efficiencies, like standardize with NATO countries. That can help us to advance more global to cooperate.
Yeah, I think defense procurement is changing. I mean, the interoperability is one way to save money, standardization. But if you look at developments of robotics, AI, quantum, the new weapon systems are going to be very different from the old weapon systems. So it's not a question of building more tanks. I think a lot of this has to do with developments in tech. Okay, one more question here, and then we'll have to close it.
Hi, I'm Kathy. I'm a student from GW and now intern in Project 2049. My questions will be like, why NATO cooperate with countries like Teller, but not like AP4 with NATO, but it's always like like individual countries from IPCP or ITPP. So why they cooperate with this like structure or model, but not just like AP4 with NATO or like South Korea, Japan, or NATO, but with individual countries? What's the logic thinking about this? Thank you.
James, please.
Sure. No, I'm happy to address that. Well, I think the answer actually is that we do both. So we do very much work with the 4 Indo-Pacific partners that we have, and we have actually agreed with those 4 countries what we call a shared agenda for security challenges. And that is the basis for much of the political and security dialogue we have with those 4 countries as a group. And so we meet in a format that we call 31+4. So 31 allies plus the 4 partner countries. And so we do actually have that framework, and that framework is about 3 years or 4 years old. And that sets the overall sort of framework for political dialogue. But then we also believe quite strongly that each nation is sovereign under the United Nations Charter, and each nation has a right to choose or not its security arrangements. And so that's why we agree programs at an individual level. And I will tell you that while there are a lot of similarities between the ITPP for Republic of Korea and the ITPP for Japan, there are in fact differences too, based on their own national security perspective. I mean, obviously, DPRK is a real challenge for both Korea and Japan, but each of them approaches the challenge differently. Each of them is looking at different capabilities that it needs and different areas where it wants to focus its cooperation. And so it's very important for us to also have that individual aspect to the partnership, because as I mentioned, we have this menu of 1,200 activities. There's no way that one country is going to have exactly the same level or the same number of activities or the same activities as another. And so we like to balance both the regional aspect and sort of the group aspect, plus also then focus on the individual, especially when we're talking about things like interoperability and standard setting. It's very important to look at the specific areas where each country wants to cooperate, because it is an expensive resources, right? They need to send experts to the technical meetings. They need to focus on how they're going to ensure that they meet the standards in specific areas. And so that takes both time and personnel and also money in order to be able to do that. So it's important that we have the commitment of each partner individually to the specific areas that they think are going to be of most interest to their own specific security situation.
Okay, thank you. As a closing note, we need to mention, of course, that President Biden will be hosting President Yoon and Prime Minister Kishida for a summit on August 18th at Camp David. So please look at our website at keia.org for our analysis of that meeting. And looking further ahead, the 2024 NATO Summit is going to mark NATO's 75th anniversary, and it'll be held in Washington, D.C., so that'll be quite an occasion. Okay, so thank you, James, for joining us. We appreciate your time. Thank you, Kome, and thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. It's been a pleasure to be here.